Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. Today, we're going to be looking at research methods.
Yeah.
Yeah, research methods. And this is a topic which I think is particularly important today with like all this information flying around all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, how do we know what to trust? It's like everyone has an agenda and everyone has data to back up whatever their agenda is.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to equip you to do, is
yeah.
to be able to see through all of that and figure
Like
out.
a BS detector.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like having a decoder ring to separate fact from fiction, right?
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that analogy. Okay, so to do this, we have a few different sources today.
Yeah, we do.
We have a textbook, which is sort of going to provide the foundation.
Yeah.
And then we have an MIT lecture, which is really interesting, sort of looks at some case studies.
Yeah, it does.
And the thing I found really fascinating about the MIT lecture was it really highlights how even sophisticated data can be misleading.
Absolutely.
If you don't know how to interpret it properly.
Yeah, and if you don't know the potential pitfalls.
Right.
And kind of the things that you need to be looking for.
Right. It's
Yeah.
not just about the quantity of data. It's like the quality of
your thinking.
of our thinking about that data.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the third source, which is kind of fun, which is a video by the organic chemistry tutor.
Right.
And it's surprisingly insightful. Like, I didn't expect to get a lot out of that.
Yeah.
But it actually had some really interesting stuff about data. Like he was talking about discrete versus continuous data.
Yeah. And he used this great example. It was like
About counting cats.
counting cats. Yeah. He said you can have like 5 cats, but you can't have like 2.37 cats.
Right. You can't have 2 and a third of a cat.
Yeah.
So that's discrete data. And that might seem like a simple concept,
Right.
but it really highlights,
A very fundamental difference.
like the different types of data that are out there. And, it impacts the types of statistical tests that you can do
Right.
and the conclusions that you can draw.
And the conclusions. Yeah. So it might seem simple, but it has a kind of a big impact on how we analyze data.
Right. Okay, so moving on, let's get into those textbook excerpts.
Okay. Yeah.
Which provide a really good foundation for understanding these concepts of validity and reliability.
Right. And these are really the cornerstones
Right.
of evaluating research. Think of them as kind of like the detective's magnifying glass and fingerprint kit.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so validity.
So validity is all about whether a study is actually measuring what it claims to be measuring.
That's a tricky one.
Yeah, it can be, yeah.
Oh.
And then reliability, on the other hand,
Okay.
is about consistency. So would we get the same results
Okay.
if we repeated the study?
Okay, so validity first. So how can you be sure that a study is truly measuring what it says it is?
Well, it's nuanced, like you said.
Yeah.
There are actually different types of validity
Right.
that the textbook highlights. And one of the most important ones is called internal validity.
Internal validity.
Yeah, and this one is all about
What is that?
being confident that the changes that you observe
Okay.
in a study are due to the factor being studied and not some other
Got it.
hidden variable.
Okay.
Right. And the MIT lecture had this really fascinating example
Yeah.
about air pollution in China.
Oh, yeah, the Huai River. That was so cool how they used geography
Yes.
to look at the effects of pollution.
That's exactly right. So the Huai River actually divided regions that had different policies on coal heating.
Okay.
So it created this natural experiment.
Right, like a natural dividing line.
Exactly. And so researchers can compare communities
With similar characteristics.
with similar characteristics, but different pollution levels because of where they were relative to the river. And they found that people living in the more polluted areas had significantly shorter lifespans.
Oh.
So this supports the idea that the pollution was a causal factor.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really compelling example of how researchers try to establish cause and effect.
Right, so that was a great example of internal validity.
Uh-huh.
But I think the lecture also pointed out that internal validity isn't
That's right.
the whole story.
Yeah, it's not the whole story. The things that make a study really internally valid, like really controlled conditions, can sometimes make it harder to generalize those findings to the real world.
Right, because the real world is messy.
Yeah, exactly.
And it doesn't have these really tightly controlled variables.
Right. So that's That's where external validity comes in.
External validity. So like a study might have really strong internal validity, meaning that in the context of that study,
Yeah.
it shows a really clear effect.
Uh-huh.
But that might not necessarily translate to what actually happens in the real world.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the MIT lecture, they gave this almost comical example
Yeah.
of an experiment where students were required to listen to conservative talk radio for 4 hours straight.
Oh, yeah.
To see how it affected their political views.
Right.
It's like,
okay, that might be internally valid.
it might be internally valid, yeah. But would people actually do that in their daily lives? Probably not.
Right.
Yeah.
Not a realistic.
It's not very realistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a constant balancing act for researchers.
I see. So it's like this tension between these two things.
Exactly. Trying to control for as many variables as possible to achieve that internal validity, but also making sure that the study reflects real-world situations to ensure external validity.
Got it. So they kind of have to make this judgment call about how much control is too much control.
Yeah, how much control is too much control, exactly.
Okay. And the textbook mentioned that validity goes even deeper than just like the overall research design, right? There's something about operational validity.
Yes. So operational validity focuses on whether the specific measurements used in the study actually reflect the concept being studied.
So, like, it's not just about the design of the study, it's also about making sure the tools that you're using
to
measure
are actually what you think they are.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting because the textbook makes the point that reliability doesn't necessarily guarantee
That's such an important point.
validity, right?
Yeah, because a measurement can be very reliable, meaning you get the same result every time you measure, but it still might not be valid.
Right.
Right. So if you were trying to measure, for example, happiness by simply asking people how often they smile, you might get very consistent responses.
Yeah.
But is smiling frequency really an accurate measure of something as complex as happiness?
Right. So even if everyone's really consistent about how often they smile, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's actually reflecting their happiness.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's the crucial difference between reliability and validity.
Got it.
Right. Just because something's measurable and it produces consistent results doesn't mean it's actually measuring what it intends to.
Okay, that is a really interesting distinction.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about that example, classic example, about the spurious correlation between organic food sales and autism rate.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the data shows this strong correlation, but does that mean that organic food causes autism? Absolutely not.
Right.
There was likely a third factor at play.
Right.
Or maybe it was just pure coincidence.
Right. It's just that they happen to be correlated, but it doesn't
They just happen to be.
mean that one causes the other.
Yeah. It's just like the equally strong correlation between education levels and GDP.
Right.
Right. So countries with higher education levels tend to have higher GDP, but that doesn't mean that education directly causes economic growth. There's a whole web of other factors involved, right?
Right. Okay, so we have to be really careful about assuming cause and effect.
Exactly. It's like being a detective, right? You have to gather evidence from different sources and look for those possible explanations before jumping to conclusions.
Right. So all those flashy charts and data visualizations that we see,
Oh, yeah.
in the news or on social media.
They might seem convincing.
They might seem very convincing.
But we have to be careful about assuming that they prove causation.
Right. And that's where understanding research methods becomes so important.
That's right.
Because it helps us to look beyond
the surface.
Yeah. It's like having X-ray vision for data.
I love that.
Right. Like helps you to see the underlying patterns and the potential biases. And, And, it's powerful.
It is. And speaking of X-ray vision, let's take a closer look at reliability.
Okay.
All right. So the textbook explains this really well, using the example of measuring a wall's height with a tape measure.
Oh, okay. I'm ready. Let's measure up to this challenge.
So even with a perfectly good tape measure, you might get slightly different readings each time you measure.
Right.
And that's what's called random error.
Okay.
It's unavoidable to some extent, but it's something that researchers try to minimize.
Right. So no measurement is ever going to be absolutely perfect.
Exactly.
There's always going to be some degree of variation.
Right.
So how does that relate to things beyond just like physical
That's a great question.
measurements?
Yeah. Well, the textbook, they applied this idea of random error to our own opinions.
Oh, interesting.
And attitudes, right. And they use this fun example of rating agreement with the statement, "I like campaign signs," printed in all caps on a 7-point scale.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
I love that example, yeah. Because even on something as trivial as that,
Yeah.
our opinions can fluctuate.
They can, yeah.
Yeah.
Like one day you might think, yeah, all caps is kind of bold, and the next day you might think it's just too shouty.
Right, exactly. And it could just be, my mood that day or...
Your mood, the context.
Yeah, who I'm talking to.
Who you're talking to, yeah. So even our own judgments aren't perfectly reliable.
So we're subject to that same random error.
To that random error.
It's built into the system.
It is, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. So understanding that concept helps us to interpret data, both from research studies and our own lives with a more critical and nuanced perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So what you're saying is recognizing that variation exists.
Yeah.
Whether it's the tape measure or our own judgments, it helps us be more realistic about data and not jump to conclusions.
And that's a key step in becoming a more discerning consumer of information.
Right, okay. This is already so insightful, and I can't wait to dive even deeper into this world of research methods. But we'll have to save that for the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're continuing our investigation into this fascinating world of research methods.
Yeah, and, it's not about memorizing all these terms, right?
Right.
It's about developing that critical lens.
Yeah.
That X-ray vision for data.
Right. It's about asking the right questions.
Yeah.
Not just taking things at face value.
Exactly. Yeah. And, speaking of looking beyond the surface, the MIT lecture brought up this really thought-provoking point about how researchers can sometimes use data to make a case for a specific agenda.
Right.
Right? Whether it's intentional or unconscious, researchers can be influenced by their own biases.
Okay.
And that can impact how they collect, analyze, and interpret the data.
Yeah, so even if they're trying to be objective, those biases can creep in.
They could creep in.
And it kind of makes you realize how important it is to understand the motivations behind the research.
Absolutely.
Like who funded the study? What were they hoping to find?
Yeah.
All those factors could influence.
They can, yeah. And even seemingly objective data, right, can be presented in different ways to support different conclusions.
It's like that saying, there are 3 kinds of lies. Lies, damned lies, and statistics.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, so how do we avoid falling into these traps?
Right. How do we make sure we're getting the full picture?
Yeah, well, the textbook offers some helpful guidance.
Okay.
One concept they highlight is face validity.
Face validity?
Yeah, which is basically a gut check.
Okay.
Does the measurement seem like it's actually measuring?
So it's that first layer?
It's that first layer of scrutiny.
Of scrutiny, okay.
Yeah, does this make sense on the surface?
Right.
Right. But the textbook also points out that face validity isn't always enough. So a measure can have face validity and still be unreliable or invalid.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. So for example, if you were trying to measure intelligence solely by asking people how smart they think they are,
okay,
that would have face validity, right?
Okay.
It seems like you're measuring intelligence.
Okay.
But self-perception isn't always accurate.
Right.
And it certainly doesn't capture the full complexity
of intelligence. Right. Okay, so it passes the initial gut check.
It does, yeah.
But it might not.
But it might not hold up.
Hold up under closer examination.
Yeah. So we need to dig deeper than just face validity.
Oh, okay.
And that's where content validity comes in.
Content validity.
So content validity is about ensuring that a measure captures all the important aspects of the concept being studied.
Okay.
Right. So the textbook uses the example of test anxiety.
Right.
So if you're trying to measure test anxiety, your measurement should include items that reflect both the physical symptoms, like, sweaty palms and racing heart, and also the cognitive aspects, like negative thoughts and worries.
Right. So you need a comprehensive...
picture.
Picture, not just an airy slice.
Imagine trying to assess a student's understanding of a complex topic by only asking multiple choice questions.
Right.
You might miss out on their deeper understanding.
Right. You're not getting the full picture.
Right. Which wouldn't be reflected
okay.
in that limited measurement.
Okay. So it's like you need to make sure you're using a wide-angle lens.
Yes, a wide-angle lens, exactly.
Right, to capture the whole
the whole scene, not just a narrow close-up.
Okay. So we've got internal validity, external validity, operational validity, and now content validity.
That's right.
So many different types of validity.
There are. Each type of validity provides a different lens through which to evaluate a study's
Got it.
strength and trustworthiness.
And I think there was one more.
There is one more.
Yeah, that we wanted to talk about.
Yes, and that is criterion validity.
Criterion validity.
So this one focuses on how well a measure predicts or correlates with other variables that it should be related to.
Right.
So remember the MIT lecture touched on this.
Oh, yeah.
With a pollution study in China.
Yeah.
So they found that higher pollution levels were associated with shorter lifespans.
Right.
But they didn't stop there.
Okay.
They wanted to see if their findings were supported by other health outcomes.
Okay.
So they looked at rates of respiratory illnesses and cardiovascular disease in those same areas.
And I bet they found a correlation.
They did. The areas with higher pollution also had higher rates of those diseases.
Right.
Which further strengthens their conclusion that pollution was negatively impacting people's health.
Yeah, it's like each piece of evidence.
It's like building a case.
Is supporting.
Yeah, each piece of evidence supports and reinforces
the other pieces.
The others.
Right. So criterion validity helps us to see how the findings connect to the bigger picture.
Exactly. And whether they align with other established knowledge.
Okay.
It's like putting the pieces of a puzzle together.
Right. Okay. So we've got all these different types of validity to consider.
Yeah.
And it's starting to feel like I have this whole toolkit for evaluating research.
You do.
But how do we actually apply this in our daily lives?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. So imagine you're scrolling through social media and you see a headline that screams, "Study shows people who eat chocolate live longer."
Okay.
What are some questions you might ask yourself to evaluate that claim?
Well, the first thing that pops into my head is like, who did that study?
Exactly.
Like, was it Hershey's chocolate?
Yeah, exactly. Was it a reputable research institution or a chocolate company?
Right.
With a vested interest. Yeah, and then you want to know more about the methods, right?
Right.
How many people were in the study?
Yeah.
Were there any other factors that could explain the results?
Right.
Like lifestyle choices, genetics.
Yeah. So you're
already thinking
like a
research detective.
Research detective.
That's the key.
Okay.
You're taking that step back and evaluating the information critically rather than just accepting it at face value.
Right. So it's developing that healthy skepticism. Absolutely. It's not about dismissing everything.
Yeah.
But it's about asking those questions. And looking for evidence.
And looking for the evidence.
It's to support the claims.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Okay.
So it's about being an active participant in the search for truth.
I love that.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about validity.
We have, yeah.
But we haven't forgotten about our other trusty tool, reliability.
That's right. Reliability is all about consistency.
Okay. Right.
Would we get the same results if we repeated the measurement?
Okay.
So remember the textbook used that really memorable example of reading agreement with the statement?
I like campaign signs printed in all caps.
Yeah. Even on something as trivial as that, our responses can fluctuate.
Right. It really highlights how our opinions and perceptions can be influenced by all these...
By so many different factors.
Yeah.
Even subconscious ones.
Right. And it's not just our opinions, like measurements.
That's right.
In research can also be affected by...
Yeah, by random error.
Random error. Like that tape measure example.
Yeah.
Even if you're using a perfectly good tape measure, you might get slightly different readings.
That's right. There's always going to be some degree of variability, even in scientific measurements.
Okay.
Right. And understanding that inherent variability is crucial for interpreting data accurately.
So recognizing that variation exists, both in our own judgments and in scientific measurements, helps us to not jump to conclusions.
Exactly.
And to look at the data.
To look at the data with a critical eye. Yeah. And that brings us to another important point. Reliability doesn't automatically...
Oh, this is a good one.
...guarantee validity.
Right. Because we could go back to that example of measuring happiness.
Exactly.
By how often people smile.
Right.
You might get really consistent answers.
Very consistent answers. But it doesn't mean
that they're actually happy.
That they're actually happy, yeah.
Right.
It's like that old saying, a broken clock is right twice a day.
Oh, yeah.
But it's still a broken clock.
Right.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So reliability is essential, but it's not the whole story.
Oh.
It's like the foundation of a building.
Okay.
You need a solid foundation, but you also need all the other components to create a functional and meaningful structure.
So reliability is like the foundation. Yeah.
And validity is like the whole building.
Yes. The structure, the design, and the purpose.
Right. And to really understand a piece of research, we need to consider both.
We need to consider both. That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
So both reliability and validity play a crucial role in evaluating the strength and trustworthiness of research.
Wow, this is already so insightful, but I'm eager to hear more about the implications of all this.
Yeah.
So let's continue our deep dive into this fascinating world of research methods in the next part.
Okay.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We are wrapping up our exploration of research methods, and man, I'm feeling like I have a whole new set of tools.
I know, me too. It's like we've been to research detective school.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because we've been talking a lot about quantitative research with all the numbers and the statistics and everything, but the MIT lecture made this point about how reliability is just as crucial in qualitative research.
Absolutely.
Which is where you're dealing with like interviews
and observations and...
That's such an important distinction because in qualitative research, we're often trying to understand these complex social phenomena,
right?
Like people's experiences, their beliefs, their motivations. And we can't just reduce those things to numbers.
So instead of measuring things with like rulers and scales, you're using words and stories.
Exactly, yeah. We're trying to understand like the richness of human experience.
Okay. So even though we're not dealing with numbers, reliability is still important.
It's still essential. We need to be confident that our interpretations of the data are consistent and that other researchers would reach similar conclusions.
So how do you ensure that consistency when you're dealing with something as subjective as human experience?
That is where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
So the textbook mentions techniques like using multiple coders to analyze the data and checking for something called inter-rater reliability.
Inter-rater.
Yeah, basically you have different researchers independently analyze the same data.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you compare their findings.
That's kind of like...
to see how much they agree.
Like a group of detectives are comparing notes.
Exactly, yeah. Making sure they're all seeing the same clues.
Yeah, right.
And it's not just about consistency across different researchers.
Right.
It's also about consistency within our own coding.
Okay.
So we need to be very rigorous and systematic in our approach, making sure we're applying the same criteria throughout the analysis.
So you're not letting your own preconceived notions...
Exactly. You're minimizing that subjectivity.
Right.
And maximizing objectivity, even when we're dealing with something as complex as human behavior.
Okay. But that kind of goes back to that point.
Yeah.
That reliability doesn't necessarily guarantee...
That's right.
Validity.
Just because multiple researchers agree on an interpretation, it doesn't mean that interpretation is accurate or meaningful.
Right. It's like that old saying, 10 million flies can't be wrong, eat garbage.
Exactly. Just because something is popular or widely accepted doesn't make it true.
Okay, so we have to consider both reliability and validity when we're evaluating.
When you're evaluating any research,
Okay, so, wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
I know we have.
We've explored these concepts of validity and reliability, the pitfalls of assuming causation based on correlation.
Right.
And, we even touched on how these play a role in quantitative and qualitative research.
We did. So what does this all mean?
Yeah, what does this all mean?
For our listeners.
For our listeners out there in the world trying to make sense of all this information.
Well, it means you are now equipped with a very powerful set of tools to critically evaluate the information that you encounter every day.
Right.
Whether you're reading a news article, scrolling through social media, or even just having a conversation with a friend.
Right.
Understanding research methods can help you separate fact from fiction.
Yeah.
Identify potential biases and make more informed decisions.
That's a really good point.
It's like having a superpower.
Yeah, the power to see through the BS.
Exactly. To see through those flimsy claims and get to the heart of what's really going on.
I like that.
It's a superpower available to anyone who's willing to learn and apply these principles.
That's great.
It transforms you from a passive consumer of information into an active participant in the search for truth.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have
Excellent.
one final thought-provoking question for our listeners.
Shoot.
So think about something you've read or heard recently that made a claim based on research.
Okay.
Maybe it was a health recommendation, a political argument, or even just a fun fact. Now put on your research detective hat.
Yes.
And ask yourself, how strong is the evidence for this claim? What are the potential biases? Could there be other alternative explanations?
Yeah. Love that. Love that.
By asking those questions.
You're taking control
They're taking control
of your information consumption.
Right.
And you're becoming a more discerning and informed individual.
That's awesome. And that is a wrap.
That's it.
On our deep dive into the world of research methods.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this journey of discovery, and we encourage you to keep asking those tough questions and never stop exploring the world with a curious
and a critical mind.
And a critical mind.